Hello and welcome to our webinar. I am Lucius Lichte, Scientific Advisor at the German Consulate here in Boston, Massachusetts. This is the third collaboration in our transatlantic webinar series on the COVID pandemic between the German consulates here in Boston and in San Francisco, as well as our partner organizations, the German-American Business Council in Boston and the German-American Business Association in Northern California. Thank you for joining us today. Today's panel discussion looks at COVID testing in a vaccinated population. While the number of fully vaccinated people in the US continues to rise, COVID-19 infection numbers remain relatively low and demand for testing is decreasing. Schools and many businesses, however, have implemented testing procedures to accelerate the return to campuses and offices. Germany even just mandated employers to offer free testing. This serves as a backdrop for today's conversation. We are asking, is testing here to stay, or will it become obsolete as people get vaccinated? What level of testing is useful to help avoid new waves of infection? Can tests help us monitor for new variants? Should vaccinated people be included in regular testing? What are the best practices and what kinds of tests are best for different contexts? We, the organizers, are thrilled to welcome an incredible group of panelists here today who represent scientists, experts, and different employers to answer these and other questions you might have. Therefore, I'm asking you to post your questions for the panelists into the Q&A below, which will be monitored during the webinar. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome our moderator, who will be leading this interesting discussion. Johannes Frühauf is President and CEO of BioLabs and the founder and president of Lab Central, a private-public partnership model for life science incubator space. Trained as a physician, he's a serial biotech entrepreneur, having dedicated much of his professional endeavors to life sciences and building startup ecosystems. Johannes, the floor and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Lucius, and thank you to the organizers, the German-American Business Council and the German-American Business Alliance in San Francisco. The GABC is in Boston, German-American Business Alliance in San Francisco, as well as the two German consulates in San Francisco and in Boston. Thank you for setting this up and inviting me to moderate this. I'm joined today by an awesome panel of experts, and I will call you all on the stage now. As you hear your names, please turn on your camera, starting with Catering Röschel. Catering is the head of school at the German International School in Silicon Valley, our partner school, because we also have a similar one in Boston that we're very happy to have. Nice to see you, Catering, and thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Ian Law, who is the Chief Information Officer for San Francisco Airport. Ian, thank you for joining us today. And of course, we are very interested in hearing your perspective on travel and testing and COVID. I can't wait to hear your insights for that.
Thank you, Johannes.
Catherine, please also stay on. We just populate the panel now. Next one, Lisa Regan, who's Vice President at Bayer in Berkeley. And Lisa set up the testing program for Bayer and has a lot of sort of on-the-ground real-life experience with testing large populations over months of time and to get them back safely to work. So Lisa, thank you for joining our panel as well. And last but not least is Galit Alter. I just saw you flash up on the screen real quick. We had a little trouble connecting with Galit. Galit, are you here? Galit is a professor at Harvard Medical School and also at has a lab at the Reagan Institute in Cambridge. And Galit is an expert on infectious diseases and has, with her team, led the response here and the testing effort that has been established around the Broad Institute to set up Massachusetts testing here for the state. We have an expert panel, which is awesome. We have a topic, which is one that that touches all of us. We all want to know, how can we, in this new world where we are slowly coming out of the pandemic, how can we think about keeping our families safe as we work, as kids go back to school, as we travel, hopefully soon enough, And so what roles will vaccines play? What roles will testing play in vaccinated populations? All of these are questions that are unclear to us, and I would hope that with all of your expert insights today, we can leave the audience a little bit better off at the end of this 1 hour, so that they know what's coming, not just what is and has been. We can all read that in the paper, but also from you to hear what is coming, what you are preparing for. I think that would be the best use of our time today. With that, maybe we'll start with Ian, because Ian, you and I, as we discussed, you are at the port of entry for thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands per week or per day travelers who are coming into the country. And I'm sure that there are big concerns as to, how are these vaccinated? Are these safe? What do we do to protect ourselves? What are the concepts that big institutions like yours are thinking about to keep the population safe in these days?
So good morning, Johannes, and thank you for having me on today. It's a pleasure to join this panel. I think we're doing two things, of course. We've passengers coming in and we've got passengers going out. And the requirement for testing, predominantly testing is the main requirement globally with travel at the moment. There are a few countries who have requirements around vaccination and proof of vaccination, but actually very, very few. The bulk of them still are relying on testing. And so the United States has a requirement for COVID, for a proof of a negative COVID test for entry into the US. And that's on inbound flights, that's sampled by the CDC in this country. But there are other countries have similar measures or more stringent measures. So if you go into the United Kingdom, they still require a negative test before you depart your originating country. And also, I believe, currently a test on day 2 and day 5 after you've arrived. So testing is certainly playing the dominant role, I think, in travel at the moment, in terms of health screening.
And we can talk about the role of vaccines separately at some point. I think because that will certainly change the picture there somewhat. I would like to hear from the practitioners, Catering running a school with hundreds of students, and Lisa organizing the testing program. Just tell us very briefly, in 1 minute or so, what you have done, and then we can go into what you will be doing. Maybe starting with you, Catering.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very curious what we hear today from the scientists, how we continue. But what we have done is, since we are back on campus in February, we test every teacher every week and every student every other week. So on Monday, our biggest room, the multi-purpose room, is a testing station. We set it up and we do free testing for everybody, teachers more than students, not because they are closer to our heart, but because the teachers travel among the cohorts. So the students stick in their cohorts in one room and the teachers go from room to room, sometimes are still behind shields, but that's what we did in testing. That means that since we are back on campus in February, we conducted about 4,500 tests. We had 1 positive, and yeah, that helped a lot and did a lot to the safety on campus for students and teachers, of course, but also for the families around. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Did you set that up yourselves, or did you use third-party providers for the testing?
We were in close contact with the CDC and asked for a provider. So a provider is coming every Monday to our school, even during vacation. We had it also in
So that means it also does add a significant cost to your operation, and that's something, of course, employers and businesses need to think about.
That's something that is taken care of in a mix of CDC, school district, and our main health care provider. Yeah. Okay. So they
Lisa,
sort of share the cost.
Over to you. You, I know, had to organize very rapidly the response for your campus to keep people safe, because you have people who need to come to the lab to do work. Maybe describe to us briefly what you have done, and then again, I do want to look forward, like from your vantage point, what does the fall look like? What does the winter look like?
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to join the panel. At the Bayer site in Berkeley, we make a medication for hemophiliacs, so it was really important that we stay in operation. And the very first thing, of course, we did was the basic precautions of whoever could work from home stays home, whoever has any symptoms stay home and call occupational medicine. We put in screening at the gate so that only asymptomatic people could come on site in the first place. 6 feet apart, everybody gets a mask when they come on site, a surgical mask. They have to wear it all the time unless you're in a room by yourself. And those precautions, wash your hands, sanitizer everywhere. Those precautions really helped us in the beginning. The testing was put in place for those people who could not work 6 feet apart based on the nature of their work. And also people who visited multiple buildings or multiple pods of people based on their work. Those people were put into a mandatory testing program, and on average, it's about 250 people tested every week. Sometimes that pool changes a bit based on work changes, people's work changes, or if they need additional people need to come on site. But by definition, we were only testing asymptomatic people. And since October, we actually had a significant number of positives in our testing program. That's 60. And we've had over 6,000 different tests done. That's not 6,000 different people, of course, because they're tested every month, every week. And while that sounds like a lot since October, it actually mimicked the community transmission rate. And on site, having done this, we had 0 on-site transmissions due to getting these asymptomatic positive folks into quarantine. So it was a very successful program. And looking forward, what we're trying to do is we're working on our exit strategy from routine testing, mandatory routine testing, because the community rates have gotten much, much lower than they were when we instituted the testing. And testing is much more widely available. We started with a PCR test, and as of March, we moved to a rapid antigen test, which allows us to get the answer much quicker, of course, in 15 minutes opposed to 48 to 72 hours. So that allows us to get folks off even quicker. But since then, we haven't had a positive, which is fantastic. We're up to, I think, more than 10 weeks with 0 positives. So, and it also mimics, well, we're a little bit better than the transmission rate in the community, and our exit strategy is based on what's happening in the community for the most part.
Will you, and that will be a question, I think, for all businesses. It's one thing to allow your own workers back on site where you know maybe their vaccination status and you've tested them over the weeks. And then the other big challenge is, will you allow visitors on site, and what will be your requirements for those? I don't know that if that applies to you on your campus, but that's certainly a big question for many businesses right now.
Yes, as of right now, we've limited the number of visitors that are allowed on site. They need to go through all of the same screening that the employees do. So they get the temperature screening and the questionnaire screening when they come on site. And based on the nature of their work, if they're going to be visiting multiple pods of people, or if they're going to be needing to be working within 6 feet of our employees, they will need to be in the testing program. That's what we've put in place at the moment. We don't have too many visitors, which is good. And or we will require them to wear N95 masks. That depends on where they're going on campus. Not all places can use N95s.
All right, thank you for that overview, Lisa. I want to go to Galit. Galit is, you are our scientist in this round today. And of course, you and I have worked together on some of these questions in the past, and I know you're very near it. Maybe let's start with some of the questions that are even coming up here that we always ask. Okay, what's the value now that there's lower incidence rates of testing in general? What are we hoping to catch, and what are the modalities that we should be employing for that? These are also changing very rapidly.
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. Thank you for inviting me here today. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Yeah, so this is a really important question because I think that we have to evolve with the testing. And that is a really important point that we have to think about, right? There's not one solution to the problem of how we're going to control this pandemic, and there's not one solution to how we're going to get out of this pandemic. I think when we have frequent testing, PCR offers, as well as antigen testing, offers a rapid way that somebody who might be infected at a particular time. Whether they're going to transmit or not, that is another question, of course. And so that is really where having these public health measures like wearing masks all the time, having social distancing included in workspaces is absolutely vital, irrespective of whether we have testing. That is a really critical measure that we cannot forget and we cannot lose sight of. I think that as we start information about the rates of spread in a population is so helpful. And this is where we have been working very closely, obviously, Johannes, between the two of us, as well as with many other public health agencies, to think about how we can blend different testing strategies, including, rapid antigen testing, where people can do this on their own, as well as antibody testing as a marker of exposure and potential infection in the absence of having, had a positive PCR test. And then thinking about the combination of what information each of these tests offers when you use them together. So if you are antibody positive and you have a positive PCR test, what does that mean? What is the consequence of that information to coming back to school or coming back to work? Because the likelihood of being infectious, even if you have a positive PCR, which we have learned often is potentially almost too sensitive in some instances, right? Depending on the CT value that we're going to use as our cutoff metric. How we act upon that data, will vary from institution to institution and from, industry to industry. So I can tell you in the hospital system, right, where we can use, and that, the fact that we have high levels of vaccination almost obviates the need for PCR testing. And so this has been a really important way that we have thought about in this population. But as we look at community-based studies where we have been able to work with other groups, including SpaceX, we've seen the power of adding antibody testing to the testing algorithm because we're able to see, waves of infection happening. That we may have missed.
Galit, 1 second. Maybe explain what is the difference between antibody testing and antigen testing. Many in the audience might not be fully familiar with that.
Okay, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. So what we're talking about when we do PCR testing or antigen testing, that's detecting actual virus in the upper respiratory tract. So we're looking for, with a PCR, the RNA or the genome of the virus. And with antigen testing, we're looking for components of the virus in the upper respiratory tract. When we're talking about antibody testing, what we're measuring is actually exposure within a person to the virus. And so that, could have been weeks in advance or months in advance, but it's essentially a marker of having been exposed to the virus. Now, the likelihood that if you have a PCR positive result in the nose and that you're going to be infectious, if you have an antibody response, is very low. If you have a PCR antigen positive result in the nose, but a negative antibody result, then you are potentially at a higher likelihood of transmission based on all the work we've done in animal studies as well as in epidemiological cohorts. So this is really where these testing combinations is very helpful. And like you said, like you were pointing out, Johannes, is very important. As we looked at, community-based infection rates, both by PCR or by antibody testing, we saw that antibody testing was actually a much more sensitive biomarker of the rates of transmission or of the rates of infection throughout a community compared to PCR, which gives you just this static signal very second. Are you infectious? But it does not mean that you may not have virus in your lungs, for example, and it's just not detected in the nose. So this is where combinations become really helpful when we think about developing actionable plans to help us make our way out of this pandemic.
Of course, the real downside of antibody testing is that you need to take my blood sample. And so it's not that easy to do at the TSA screening site or at the gate of getting into the German school or at Bayer's front gate, right? It's something that can be well conducted. I think if you have a controlled and limited population, maybe of your employees, or maybe even of all of your students and teachers at a school, but probably much harder to do in a transitory or a public setting. I think I understand that it's very interesting for you epidemiologically to see, okay, we've got a population here that has much higher rates of past incidents, right? Like, because they've been through it, obviously they're carrying antibody. But how is that practically going to be useful for businesses? Probably not so much.
Well, okay, so this is a really interesting question. We keep having this discussion with lots. There are tests that are coming out that are going to be very rapid. It's going to be a saliva swab, and it's going to give you a rapid detection of whether or not you have antibody. And where we're being pushed the most, this is an interesting discussion to think about as a group, because it can be as fast, maybe even faster than the antigen test. But the question is going to be is, do I have protective levels of antibodies to the variants of concern? Ian, if I told you, I could tell you that every person coming into the airport is protected or not against a variant. Would that, be something I think people would want to know? I mean, I would assume from a public health standpoint, everybody wants to know, right? So Johannes, I think the old days of being able to basically, have to take blood to do an antibody level. I mean, all those days of testing are, I think that they are so to 2020, right? We are now in.
That's great. You guys are making so much progress. I love it.
The whole world has changed for developing vaccines and developing diagnostics. I think that we will see a massive revolution. The question that we need from you to understand as a scientific community is, what information is most useful? If you tell us what is useful, we will build you the assay you need. But again, it's thinking about what information is actionable and how do you use this data to make decisions like, do I need a booster? Do I need a different flavor of vaccine? Will I be protected or not? Is my PCR positivity really a worry? Or is it just some sort of random PCR, error? That's where antibody testing really comes in handy. But as I said before, it's all about combination testing. We are no longer in 2020. We got to come into this new generation and understand how we can use combos to make better decisions.
I'd love to have these saliva tests for antibody levels widely available, because as we know, one of the big concerns when I talk with my family or friends is that, okay, now we're all vaccinated, but two things. One, is the vaccine going to protect me against these mutants that Ian and his colleagues at SFO are importing into the country? One. And then two, we know from the early vaccinations that the antibody levels in vaccinated individuals or in patients who have been through a natural COVID infection tend to decrease very rapidly. But if we have high antibody titers, we're protected even against those mutants. And of course, Ian, I didn't mean to attack you in any way. This is a tongue-in-cheek comment. But I think it will be so valuable for us to be able to have cheap and rapid access so that we can measure antibody levels in populations going forward. Ian, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the practice that you currently have and that you're anticipating. And I imagine that you probably can't anticipate further out than a few months, but like, what are the practices that you're planning for maybe for the next 6 months at SFO? Well,
we've opened a number of test sites here at the airport, 3 of them now at present. And, one of the things that's important for the airport to get into here is that as an airport, we're doing not explicitly as an airline. So nobody is favored by one particular carrier over another one. I think you have to make that service available to everybody. But I think which kind of comes back a bit to Galit's point, which is we're also not looking to make airports the test centers of the world. They are I don't want to say, the test center of last resort, but certainly we would prefer more, call it integrated testing in society, so that people had a better sense of where they stood ever before they needed to travel. And there's a piece of the travel process here which we learned already through the immigration process how this works. In other words, if you don't have a valid passport, you can't get a boarding pass. So if you try to get your boarding pass from home without a valid passport, it just won't work. So should we be thinking about extending, we as in the country and other countries be thinking about extending that to health as well? And there's, I'm certainly heartened by what I'm seeing lately in terms of announcements about testing. We've heard about the saliva tests. I don't know much about the test itself, but I did see an announcement from one of the major airlines the other day that they've invested heavily in a breathalyzer test. Again, so that the concept of these more ubiquitous tests all over the place is really interesting to us, and particularly I think home testing and where that's likely to get to, because of course that helps us not become the the testing center, as it were.
In terms of following the mutation, so we have to assume that so the science fiction version is that we will all have sufficient antibody titers that even any new mutant can't penetrate a population and propagate. But that is wishful thinking, we know, and there are huge reservoirs of people that are completely unprotected and in which the virus is circulating very nicely and optimizing. So we likely are facing a reality where this thing is going to be with us for years to come. And so that means all of our institutions need to be prepared for it, because it does have serious health effects. It's not just a cold, right? Like many people have long-term effects or they can die from it. So what are we doing to track these mutations? Maybe Galit, you can give us a view from the scientific point of view, and then you have to break it down as well, because if the Broad Institute is able to do sequencing, that does not mean that Lisa at Bayer is able to do sequencing, or even less that Catering at the German school in Silicon Valley will be able to do sequencing. So how can we stay in front of these, of this risk?
Yeah, so let me give, I always like to start with the optimistic perspective, because I am a glass half full kind of person. But I think that the one thing that I want to just mention is that, the 6 months interim data that came out of Moderna and Pfizer clearly shows declining antibody responses, especially declining neutralizing antibody responses. But what they're seeing, which is really, I think, more important, is that they're seeing very stable levels of protection in the population. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, your line is somewhat choppy, but we hear it. But we hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, you're on, Galit.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think I'm cutting out all the time.
Well, you're okay. All right, maybe we'll get Galit into an area of better reception and go over to Lisa. Lisa, you are responsible for large numbers of employees and you need to design the program. You have a test right now. You mentioned you went over to the antigen test, and we know that the antigen test will also detect those variants, because they all still need the spike protein to be there. Are you planning on introducing sequencing to screen for variants at Bayer?
No, we are not, for various reasons, one of which is the HIPAA laws of protecting medical information. And we are not in we're not in the business of sequencing. If that became a community issue where sequencing was more of a requirement to determine what kind of positive somebody is, then that would need to be put into the consent form. And then we would have an external company do that if that was needed. But again, we're going to keep our eye on the local community, those transmission rates, and work from there. But in general, no, I don't think that's in the plans.
So we'll probably have to stick with even, I mean, Bayer being a global company with somewhat unlimited resources, we'll have to stick with sort of the relatively simple testing. And I suppose that's the same at your school, Catering. There's a question here coming in. What about children in school since they can't be vaccinated yet? Is testing using the simple antigen tests your plan for the fall?
We have a plan till summer, because one thing we learned is don't plan too long ahead. So we test till summer since we have kids that are not vaccinated, of course, nobody under 12, but we appreciate more and more that one of the great side effects of being so used to testing every Monday will be that we have that logistics set up. So whether we need fresh up shots or different tests, everybody knows, everybody has an app on their cell phone, and we know how to do it. So the logistics is clear, we are trained. And since we have very, very young kids that won't be vaccinated for a while, we plan on continuing, of course.
You mentioned the app on the cell phone. We have a similar one here at the German school in Boston where we fill out every morning whether our kid has any symptoms. The software solutions, I think, could be a way out of this. I know that, Ian, your title is Chief Information Officer. I'm sure you're not a Chief Infectious Diseases Officer, but you've been dragged into this space because of the data component of this, right? And I know that there is a multitude of standards right now. In America, we are getting this little printed plastic or cardboard card that says we are vaccinated. In Germany, they're working on an electronic passport. I'm sure in the UK they have yet another solution, and in France. So what's the answer there? The technological answer that can help us out of that. I would love to have a thing on my phone that has me maybe take a test in the morning, and then I'm cleared for the day to go to a concert and to a movie theater and to a flight with you. And are people working on these solutions?
Yeah, so I think you know, on the one side we're talking obviously a lot about testing and test labs. There's a whole world now growing up of test credential operators, if you like, verifiable test credential operators. So we've got things like Common Pass, AOK Pass, IATA Travel Pass, all these different pass schemes. I know IBM has been working on one in Germany to essentially allow people to have a digital credential, because there's a real concern about fraud of, you know, just handwriting test results and handwriting vaccination cards. And so trying to get that into the digital process is important. But also for us, just in the airport environment, it also, if you have a digital credential, a QR code essentially verifying vaccination and or test results, it allows us to have, allows us a touchless process for passengers moving through the airport, so less exchanges of bits of paper and so on. It allows us to do things in local languages for people at borders who have to check these things, because the QR code can be just translated into any language you like. And so there are a lot of different benefits to it, and it also speeds up the process. So one of the things that one of our airlines reported here is that for an international departing passenger, the check-in time is typically about 4 minutes when they've bags and all of these things. When they have to do document checks around testing, because every sheet of paper is different, and because an agent at a counter is now trying to interpret this sheet of paper that they're not used to seeing, that 4 minutes goes up to over 16 minutes. And so the digital process that's been tested, and SFO tested one recently in conjunction with our partners at LAX to Charles de Gaulle Airport with Air France using a digital pass. And that was very successful in taking that 16 minutes back down to, you know, probably under 6. So we see a need for these. There's a lot of different thoughts around the world as to, you know, which one is the right one. There won't be a right one. There'll be many of them. The really key thing is that we have interoperable standards between them so that the information can be shared. So, you know, you have one pass, I have another, it means I can get into the sport event, you can't get into one. Well, that it's not going to work very well. It also won't work very well if you've got to have 5 or 10 or 15 different pass apps on your phone. So this interoperability is going to be really key. But we see certainly a big need for these to get that travel process going again.
Here's a question that came from Christian in the audience, and I think it goes directly to what you're describing, Ian. Does anybody know whether the CDC vaccination card will be accepted in Germany today, because he doesn't have the yellow international vaccination pass?
I'll give you an answer without an answer, which is it's a very fluid situation, very, very fluid as to what's being accepted where. And I think that, so I wouldn't hazard a guess. I have heard cases where cards from different countries are not being accepted in other countries because people just don't know the validity of a handwritten card. But it is something that's almost unique between every origin and destination at the moment, which is very, very challenging in our sector. And one of the technology things we've been working on is how do we make that an awful lot easier by having everybody validate their rules up front so that passengers don't have to go working all this out on their own, because that is really, really complicated otherwise.
It's interesting. There's another question here that asks, would rapid on-site testing, and the participant Martin Hahn is asking about events, conferences, and other larger scale events, is asking, will these become a regular practice? I think this is a question for everybody, because we can't really rely on the vaccination records, as Ian is saying. Some people may just say they're vaccinated, or so I would much prefer to know that when I go to this venue that every person is in fact tested. Is that even practical? Has anybody tried that at a large scale? Is that practical in terms of throughput and cost? I don't know. Anyone on the panel could answer this.
Are you referring to antibody testing to prove that you've had a vaccine, Johannes? Or are you talking about doing PCR conferences?
No, I think the practical question is, like, you want to go to a rock concert, or you want to go to a movie theater, and while you are vaccinated, you would still like to know that there's not huge amounts of infectious particles in the area, because you may have a child at home who's not yet vaccinated. And so to have a level of comfort that allows for participants to now go there with a good conscience, and not the fear factor that, oh, I might be picking up a virus at this venue. I hear from some of my own colleagues at Lab Central, where we are now slowly releasing our restrictions in accordance with the CDC recommendations. You know, fully vaccinated people can share a conference room, for example, even without wearing masks now. That some of them are very hesitant to do that because their children at home that are under 11 years old or 12 years old have not been vaccinated yet. And so they would very much prefer a situation where we hang on to the masks for much longer, or we have mandatory testing every day to make sure that we are sort of mostly eliminating the risk. Is that even practical? Has that even been practiced at any corporate level before? And I know a good moderator should direct this question to one speaker. Maybe Galit, you're very close to these questions. Do you know if that's done somewhere? Can that be done? Is that even too much overkill organizationally?
I think it's a really hard ask, you know, because there's no definitive answer, right? There's no guarantee that you're not going to have one person in a mask that's going to be potentially infectious and that isn't carrying some magical variant that could be potentially, you know, resistant to the vaccine-induced immune responses. I think that there are, like I mentioned before, combined antigen antibody tests that are coming out now that will eventually give you information on both. You know, are you, you know, immune or are you also carrying a virus? Whether it's going to be a variant or not, I think that that's not possible, but it's not known. But there are certainly a number of technologies coming out to basically do the simultaneous testing. I think in the end, I think that what it's going to come down to is that, there has to be some sort of information, trust that we're going to have to build into our normal daily lifestyle, right? There's no other way around it. If we look at Australia as an example, right, I think that once they got their rates down low enough, they were able to reopen everything, and they were able to take their masks off and go to concerts, and New Zealand did the same. I mean, it's just, life is possible as we get our numbers down low enough and as we get our vaccine rates high enough. And we're not going to be able to control every virus that comes into the country. And I don't think that we should be worried about that. That is not the point. I think that our job as a community now is to make sure that we get vaccine rates high enough that we can diminish spread, right? That is number one. We close the fire hose, so you only have a little trickle, but you don't have this massive burden to deal with. And we boost as often as possible. And that's what the data is showing. The data is showing that as long as people get boosted on an annual basis, we can keep the antibody levels high enough. We will not be dealing with the levels of mortality and severity of disease that we were dealing with about a year ago. And that's really the essence of the messaging that I'm hearing from both the public health and the scientific community, is that the vaccines work, and they also work against the variants. That there's no question that we're not it's concern. I think that we have a path out of this pandemic.
I think Galit is cutting in and out again. Ian, this is another question that is, of course, not directly related with testing, but it's related with the vaccine. Of course, there are travel restrictions that require, or travel destinations, for example, or travel origins that require you as a traveler to show a vaccination record. If you want to travel to certain countries, you need to be vaccinated against infectious diseases such as yellow fever and others. And that's an international requirement. Is there any talk in your circles of requiring vaccination and vaccination records? We spoke about testing now, which is easy to do on site, but now what's the thought here in your industry about requiring vaccination as a prerequisite for travel?
Well, we obviously follow the regulations of the countries. I mean, we don't make them ourselves, but we're starting to see more discussion around that now, and there are small pockets of this. I came across a country a few days ago where they require they require 14-day quarantine, but they will reduce that quarantine if you have proof of vaccination on your inbound arrival, and also that on day 5 you produce a negative PCR test. So everyone's got a different permutation and combination of doing this at the moment. I think, but I think we're going to see more of it, and I'm watching quite carefully, because I've seen airlines advertising that they specifically are now flying with fully vaccinated crews. And I wonder, when passengers are thinking of making that ticket purchase, is that going to make a difference? Would they even attach a premium to that? And that can be done in some countries and not others. So it's not a simple answer for every airline either. But we're starting to see this vaccination thing now becoming a differentiating factor, I guess. And between countries and between different services that are being offered.
It may, of course, help us with vaccination rates if your participation is facilitated if you're vaccinated, right? There are still some people who have concerns that are other than medical concerns against the vaccine, and where behavioral gating could help increase the vaccination rates, which is of course in the common interest. Lisa, when you, as an employer, when you think about that, are you able to mandate for your employees to get the vaccine? Is that something that an employer may even require, or can you ask for the vaccination status? What's the thinking here?
Yeah, Bayer has decided not to require or mandate vaccinations, although we are highly encouraging everybody to get vaccinated, of course. And we've partnered with Berkeley Public Health to make it as easy as possible for our employees to get vaccinated. And we also, since we're not mandating the vaccine, we can't mandate that they tell us that they've been vaccinated. But again, we're highly encouraging, and we have a special link for people to be able to contact the occupational medicine and have their medical information remain private, but let Bayer know that they've been vaccinated. And one that is going to be one of the drivers to helping us open the site more towards the end of the year or beginning of next.
Thank you. And so you said you have determined internally that that's the case. That means there's probably room for interpretation or wiggle room, that there's not a cast in stone standard. Catering, I know that as schools, we do mandate certain types of vaccination against common infectious diseases in children as a prerequisite for enrollment. Yes, there may be religious or medical exemptions, but typically it is a rule. Have you had discussions with your colleagues and other heads of schools about mandating COVID vaccines when they become available for children that you serve?
Absolutely. We have the California Association of Independent Schools where we are a member, and it's almost a weekly topic. Do we not? And as mandatory as it is for students in California and on the East Coast in Boston as well, to get vaccinated, we never were allowed to ask our teachers to get vaccinated. And we're never allowed to ask for the vaccination status even. I mean, I did it as a student in New York, I got vaccinated myself, our students, but for teachers it's not allowed. That rule just changed here in California. For COVID, we are allowed to ask. The teachers still don't have to tell us. We are not allowed to ask to get vaccinated, but to share the status with us. So our colleagues can choose either they show us proof that they are vaccinated or they continue testing every week. So they don't even have to share it. If you decide not to share, keep getting tested. That's what the deal is at this point.
Thank you. Even for vaccinated populations, there will be some that aren't protected. And there's a question from Michael Heller in the audience that is asking a scientific question. Galit, maybe you can share that with all of us. The question was, if you are an immunocompromised patient, and of course these conditions could be infectious disease to chemotherapy or other conditions, maybe you're an organ transplant recipient, that may compromise your ability to produce antibodies after receiving the vaccine. So what is the guidance for these patients? Can they consider themselves to be protected to some extent? Does your science, Galit, offer them antibody level testing, titer testing, or how do patients like that, what guidance can you give them?
Yeah, that's a really important point that Michael Heller brought up. So I think that the important thing is that, from the immunogenicity profiling, it's clear that folks who are immune compromised, and this can be anything from something like pregnancy, which we consider to be a healthy state, but of course dampened immunity, all the way through to the elderly population, and that varies 65 to 90 years old, they will have lower level immune responses following vaccination. But the important point to remember is that we don't yet have a cutoff. We don't know what the number is that is required to get to immunity, right? So right now we're saying that, of course, the general population in the phase 3 trials, all of us on the call probably have very high levels of antibodies, but that doesn't mean that a slightly lower level may not still be protective. And we have not yet really been able to examine levels of protective immunity in those populations. Now, that being said, what I did want to bring up with Michael is that we are in the process of creating boosting regimens now. So that means is that we're, as many people have said, the CDC, WHO, Dr. Fauci, and many others, we are going to need boosts for this vaccine. There is no way around that. And there may be a need to boost sooner sooner, for example, for some populations like individuals who are immune compromised. And those trials are already underway to really assess whether or not with that third boost, could you augment immunity to a level that's going to reach the levels that we think right now are protective, but we might find that might be much lower. The other point that I want to make, and I think this is also really important, is that we're seeing a movement now, also now that we're making our way out of the initial phase of rollout, is the possibility of combining different vaccine platforms. And what we've known for many years in the immunological community, in the vaccine development community, is that combinations of platforms often drive advantageous immune responses. And so we're going to see in the next few years, that the regimens for the vaccines are going to change, boosting is going to increase, and that's going to give us the ability to drive immunity to sufficient levels in even the immune compromised population. But I have to say that the epidemiological modeling to me is really quite compelling. And I would point Michael and others to those data. You can find it very easily if you search for it. But it shows that once we reach herd immunity, once we've hit over 70% in the population, there is very low probability of transmission and potential infection, even in those that have lower antibody titers. And so figuring out that sweet spot of where we can maintain 70% herd with boosting is really the way that we are going to basically be able to, make sure that we keep folks out of the hospitals with this particular virus.
Does that mean we can't travel to certain states in the union?
I don't think so. I think if you're vaccinated, and even if you're not, we know that masks and social distancing works, right? That is the fact of the matter, right? If you continue to wear masks, there is no reason, if you have, the right PPE and the right hygiene, that you can avoid this virus. If you have vaccines on board as well, then, you basically have the full-on barrier to protect yourself. I think the question is, when can everyone take off their masks, even indoors, right? And that going to the concerts, I think, Johannes, I'm with you, I'm ready. But I think that, that's where we're going to have faith in vaccines, and to really dig into the speed with which the vaccine community is building these metrics to understand where is the cutoff. And then that cutoff will be high value for how we decide when to boost, how to boost, who's vulnerable, who's not. And that's going to be the final way that we can administer vaccines most intelligently.
Thank you, Galit. We're coming up on the hour. I always want to conclude and ask our panelists to maybe give me a 1-minute vignette of what you think our audience should learn and should take away from this, so that they leave this 1 hour invested time richer and more knowledgeable than they started with us. Can we do a quick round of lightning ideas? Ian, starting with you. What do you want the audience to know going forward?
Well, I think it's just, I don't know, am I going to enrich them with this, but I think it's worth knowing that it's a highly dynamic environment. This is, if I think of other situations that have impacted our industry particularly, would have been 9/11. Post 9/11, the whole world really got together on standard security practices. We're not getting together on standard health practices in this case, because there are a lot of rules are changing, and they're driven locally, so they change very quickly. And so I think that the dynamic of the environment is important. And I think therefore, back to that CDC question earlier, you just have to watch for the updates and get good sources of information, because it is changing all the time. I think the second thing is that these digital passes are likely to be here to stay. I think it's going to take us a while to, not just our industry, but generally for us all to figure out how this is going to work effectively, so that I think, Johannes, you made the point, can I have one pass to go into go to a venue, get on an airplane, go here, go there. We're going to be looking for those more and more. So it'll be interesting to see how, particularly the technology industry responds to that one. And lastly, just to Galit's point about the masking and so on, there are a lot of announcements coming out about mask rules and distancing rules and so on. But on the airport side, within the airports, those rules are often very different. So we might have local rules in California, but federal rules from the TSA. And so again, I just always say to people, keep an eye on what the airport rules are, and don't be annoyed at the airport if somebody says, put the mask on no matter what you heard when you were 5 miles away, because they are the rules that we play by here. So I think they're really my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So it's a very dynamic environment, and traveler beware. Keep eyes open. What you heard today may not be true in 2 weeks. Catering, we all have kids in the schools. Any sort of quick ideas to give parents that are worried about their kids?
Yeah, thank you. We are in Silicon Valley. We managed to teach online. We just proved with our Abitur exams, they didn't lose any knowledge input, really not. And just go and do it the way it's possible. But I can also tell you, it's so much better to teach in person and to have that, all the other aspects of teaching. Therefore, a big thank you to all the scientists who did it. And since I'm head of a German-American school or of a German school abroad, I mean, Pfizer-BioNTech was the best proof that international education works. That's it.
Yeah, let's educate more of these future scientists. That would be awesome.
Absolutely, that's what I'm gonna tell my graduates next Saturday when we have graduation. I mean, science is really as cool as it gets.
I'm with you there. Lisa, as from the employer point of view, what should employers think about as they prepare for the next few months?
Don't be too quick to let down the safeguards. As Galit said, the masks, the 6 feet apart, the hygiene have really prevented any on-site transmissions for us in Berkeley. And it's really key that we continue that and to encourage as much as possible those vaccinations. It's going to be key to opening back up.
Thank you. And Galit, you get the last word. Give us your glass half full.
So, yeah, so my only ask is just everyone explain to the community, everyone you know, everyone that you work with, vaccines are incredibly effective public health interventions. They are the #1 intervention that saves lives every year. And they are incredibly safe. We monitor them at an unbelievable scrutiny. And it's just a real scientific marvel to see the speed with which we've made vaccines against this pathogen. And the faster we get these vaccines out, the faster we're going to be out of this pandemic. So, just advocate for vaccines. And thanks for putting this panel together, really important.
Thank you, Galit, for giving us that scientific perspective. And I'm sure that we all took optimism away from your conveyance of how the science is progressing there. Thank you very much to all of you on this panel. Thank you for your time and your thoughts. And I'm grateful to the organizers who have set this up, and look forward to staying in touch with all of you. I know that the German American Business Association and the GABC are organizing other such events. And there will be an announcement, I think, about an upcoming event series after we log off here. So thank you all. Have a nice week. Stay safe and get your second dose. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you so much, panelists. It was so informative. Thank you all. And I just wanted to point out 2 event series on artificial intelligence. Transatlantic AI has to do with Germany and the US. One is a hackathon series. The other one is a webinar series. The webinar series has already started. You will find more information on transatlantic.ai on these events and series. And we'd love to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.